The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Pinon, New Mexico territory, as Fiona Evans' screams pierced the afternoon quiet, her wrists raw from the coarse ropes that bound them. 3 men dragged her through the dirt toward a waiting dun-colored horse, her heels digging desperate furrows in the earth that did nothing to slow their determined pace. From the shadow of the livery stable, Ryder Vance watched the scene unfold, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip as rage bubbled up inside him at the sight of a woman being treated worse than cattle bound for slaughter. It was the summer of 1878, and Pinon had seen its fair share of lawlessness since the silver mines opened 2 years prior. But even in a frontier town where violence was commonplace, the sight of the Blackwell brothers, notorious for their claim jumping and worse, manhandling a woman in broad daylight, crossed a line that Ryder couldn't ignore. His conscience wouldn't allow him to simply ride away, not when he recognized the unmistakable terror in the woman's eyes. "You're hurting me. Please, I've done nothing wrong," Fiona cried out, her voice cracking with fear as she struggled against her captors. Her once neat blue dress was torn at the shoulder, smudged with dirt, and her honey blonde hair had come loose from its pins, falling in tangled waves around her flushed face. "Shut your mouth, woman," growled the largest of the 3 men, jerking the rope hard enough to make her stumble. "You'll fetch a fine price across the border. Pretty thing like you might even end up as a rich man's wife if you're lucky." His laughter was cold, echoing by his companions as they continued dragging her toward their waiting horses. Ryder had heard enough. In one fluid motion, he stepped out from the shadows, his spurs jingling softly as he moved into the street. At 32, he'd spent most of his adult life in the saddle, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, before finally settling into work as a hired gun for the Silver Crescent Mining Company. He wasn't a lawman, but he had his own code, and what he was witnessing violated it to the core. "That's far enough, Blackwell," Ryder called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. A few townsfolk who had been averting their eyes now peered cautiously from doorways and windows, eager to witness the confrontation but unwilling to intervene. "Let the lady go." The 3 men turned toward him, the largest one Silas Blackwell squinting against the sun. Recognition dawned on his weather-beaten face, followed by a sneer. "This ain't your business, Vance. Company man should stick to guarding silver, not poking his nose where it don't belong." Ryder took another step forward, his hand hovering near his gun. He was aware that he was facing 3 armed men, but backing down wasn't an option. Not now, not with the woman's frightened eyes fixed on him as though he were her last hope in the world. "I'm making it my business," he replied evenly. "Now cut her free before this gets ugly." The youngest Blackwell brother, barely 20 and already sporting a nasty scar across one cheek, spat in the dirt. "There's 3 of us and one of you, Vance. Those ain't odds I'd bet against." Ryder didn't bother responding to the taunt. Instead, in one swift motion, he drew his knife from its sheath and closed the distance between them, slicing through the rope that bound Fiona's wrists before any of the brothers could react. He positioned himself between her and the Blackwells, his back straight, feet planted firmly in the dirt. "Run to the sheriff's office," he said quietly to Fiona without turning around. "Tell Sheriff Donovan what these men were trying to do." But Silas Blackwell was already drawing his pistol, rage contorting his features. "Big mistake, Vance. You just signed your death warrant." The first shot rang out before Silas could fully raise his weapon. Ryder's bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around. The second Blackwell brother fired wildly, the shot going wide as Ryder dropped to one knee and returned fire with deadly precision. The man clutched his chest, shock registering on his face before he crumpled to the ground. The youngest Blackwell, seeing both his brothers wounded, lost his nerve. He turned tail and ran for his horse, scrambling awkwardly into the saddle and spurring the animal hard down the street, disappearing in a cloud of dust. Silas, clutching his bleeding shoulder, backed away toward his own mount. "This ain't over, Vance," he snarled, his face pale with pain and fury. "Not by a long shot." "It's over for today," Ryder replied steadily, his gun still trained on the wounded man. "Get your brother to a doctor if you can find one who'll treat the likes of you, and don't come back to Pinion." Silas managed to heave his wounded brother over a saddle before mounting his own horse, cursing fluently as he rode out of town, his injured shoulder making his posture uneven in the saddle. Only when they were well out of sight did Ryder finally holster his weapon and turn to look for the woman he'd rescued. Fiona hadn't run to the sheriff as he'd instructed. Instead, she stood rooted to the spot, her blue eyes wide with shock, her hands pressed against her mouth. When their eyes met, something passed between them, a moment of connection that seemed to transcend the violence they just experienced together. "Are you hurt, madam?" Ryder asked, his voice gentler now as he approached her cautiously, aware that after what she'd been through, she might be frightened of any man coming near her. Fiona lowered her hands slowly, revealing a face that, despite the dirt and tear streaks, was strikingly beautiful. "No, she swallowed hard, visibly collecting herself. "You saved my life, those men. They were going to sell me. Name's Ryder Vance, madam, and I did what any decent man would do." He offered a slight bow, tipping his hat. "May I ask your name?" "Fiona Evans," she replied, her voice steadier now. "I arrived on the stage yesterday. I'm a teacher. I came to take the position at the schoolhouse." She glanced down at her torn and dirty dress, a flash of embarrassment crossing her features. "Though I'm hardly looking the part at the moment." Before Ryder could respond, the town sheriff finally appeared, huffing and puffing as he hurried down the street, rifle in hand. Several curious onlookers were beginning to emerge from the various shops and businesses, drawn by the gunfire and now that the danger had passed, eager for gossip. "What in tarnation happened here, Vance?" Sheriff Donovan demanded, his bushy mustache quivering with indignation. "I heard shots." Ryder explained the situation succinctly, watching as the sheriff's expression shifted from suspicion to grudging approval. Fiona added her own account, describing how the three men had approached her as she was walking back to her boarding house after visiting the schoolhouse, claiming they had a message from the school board before suddenly grabbing her. "Damn Blackwell brothers," the sheriff muttered, shaking his head. "Been nothing but trouble since they drifted into these parts. I'll send telegrams to Santa Fe and Las Cruces, put out wanted notices." He turned to Fiona, his expression softening slightly. "Miss Evans, I apologize for what happened to you in our town. Pinion's generally peaceful, despite what you witnessed today." "It seems I have Mr. Vance to thank for that," Fiona replied, glancing at Ryder with a grateful smile that made something twist unexpectedly in his chest. The sheriff nodded. "Vance here works security for the mine, but he's handy to have around town, too." He looked around at the growing crowd and frowned. "All right, folks, show's over. Go on about your business." As the onlookers reluctantly dispersed, Ryder noticed that Fiona was trembling slightly, the delayed shock of her ordeal finally setting in. Without thinking, he removed his long duster coat and draped it gently around her shoulders. "Miss Evans, may I escort you back to your boarding house? I imagine you'd like to rest after." He gestured vaguely at the street where the confrontation had taken place. Fiona nodded, pulling his coat tighter around her slim frame. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Vance. I'm staying at Mrs. Holloway's place on Cedar Street." "I know it," Ryder replied, offering his arm. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, her touch light but firm. As they walked away from the scene, He couldn't help but notice how she held her head high despite everything that had happened. There was a strength in her that went beyond her delicate appearance. "You're very brave, Miss Evans," he said quietly as they turned onto Cedar Street. "Most folks would be hysterical after what you just went through." Fiona gave a small, humorless laugh. "I believe I'm still in shock, Mr. Vance. The hysterics may come later in private." She glanced up at him, her blue eyes meeting his brown ones directly. "And I wouldn't have had the chance for either if you hadn't intervened." "How did you know what those men intended?" Ryder's expression darkened. "The Blackwells have a reputation. They've been running a small operation selling women to brothels in Mexico, among their other unsavory activities. The law has been trying to catch them at it, but they are slippery." He shook his head. "I couldn't stand by and watch them take you." They reached the neat white clapboard house where Mrs. Holloway ran her boarding house. Ryder had never been inside, but he knew it was considered the respectable option for single women in Pinyon, mostly the few school teachers, nurses, and shop clerks who comprised the town's limited population of unmarried females. "Would you like me to explain to Mrs. Holloway what happened?" he offered, knowing how quickly gossip spread in small towns and how damaging it could be, especially to a woman's reputation. Fiona seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. "Yes, that might be best. She's a kind woman, but very proper. I'd rather she heard the truth from us than some embellished version from the town gossips." Mrs. Holloway, a plump widow in her 50s with iron gray hair and piercing eyes that missed nothing, listened to their account with increasing alarm, her hand pressed to her heart. "My dear Miss Evans," she exclaimed when they'd finished, "how utterly dreadful! And on your second day in Pinyon, I declare if I'd known you were walking about town alone, I would have insisted on sending my nephew as an escort." She turned to Ryder, her expression softening. "Mr. Vance, I cannot thank you enough for coming to Miss Evans' rescue. Such gallantry is rare these days, even in the West where men pride themselves on their chivalry." Ryder shifted uncomfortably under the praise, unused to such effusive gratitude. "Just did what needed doing, madam, Mrs. Holloway insisted on preparing tea, fussing over Fiona and clucking sympathetically about her torn dress. As they sat in the boarding house's tidy parlor, Ryder found himself studying Fiona more carefully. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 23 or 24, with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her youth. When she spoke about her journey from Boston to take up the teaching position in Pinyon, her eyes lit up with enthusiasm despite her ordeal. "I've always wanted to come west," she explained, some color returning to her cheeks as she warmed to her topic. "My father was a teacher, and he instilled in me a love of education. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher needed in New Mexico territory, it seemed like an adventure worth taking." "It's certainly different from Boston," Ryder commented, thinking of the rough and ready mining town with its saloons and brothels existing alongside the more respectable establishments. "Pinyon has its charms, but it's still growing into civilization." "That's precisely why teachers are needed," Fiona replied earnestly. "Children here deserve the same opportunities as those in eastern cities. Education is the great equalizer." Her passion for her calling was evident, and Ryder found himself admiring not just her physical beauty but her spirit and determination. He couldn't recall the last time he'd met a woman who intrigued him on so many levels. As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Holloway eventually excused herself to prepare dinner, leaving Ryder and Fiona alone in the parlor. A slightly awkward silence fell between them until Fiona spoke. "Mr. Vance, I realize I haven't properly thanked you," she said softly. "What you did today facing those 3 men alone, it was extraordinarily brave." Ryder shook his head. "Not brave, Miss Evans, just necessary." He hesitated, then added, I've seen what happens to women taken by men like the Blackwells. No decent man could stand by and let that happen." Fiona studied him intently. "You're not what I expected when I imagined the people I'd meet in a frontier town, Mr. Vance." "How so?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You carry a gun and clearly know how to use it, but there's a gentleness about you." She smiled slightly. "A contradiction." Ryder felt an unexpected warmth at her assessment. "Out here, Miss Evans, contradictions are what keep a man alive. The West demands both strength and compassion, though the latter often gets buried beneath the former." She nodded thoughtfully. "Will they come back? The Blackwells, I mean." He considered the question carefully, not wanting to frighten her but unwilling to lie. "It's possible. Silas Blackwell isn't known for forgetting a grudge, and I wounded both him and his brother. But they'd be fools to try anything in town again, not with everyone on alert now." "And I imagine you've made yourself a target by helping me," she said, her expression troubled. "I'm sorry for that." "Don't be," Ryder replied firmly. "I've had men gunning for me before, and I'm still here." He rose from his chair, suddenly aware that he'd stayed far longer than propriety allowed. "I should be going. The mine owners will want to report about what happened today." Fiona stood as well, handing him back his duster coat with a grateful smile. "Thank you again, Mr. Vance, for everything." As their hands briefly touched during the exchange, Ryder felt a jolt of awareness that caught him by surprise. He tipped his hat to cover his reaction. "Miss Evans, it was a pleasure meeting you despite the circumstances. I hope the rest of your time in Pinyon proves less eventful." She laughed, a genuine musical sound that transformed her face. "After today, I think I could use a little less excitement." As Ryder stepped out onto the porch, he turned back impulsively. "The school term doesn't start for another week, does it?" Fiona nodded, a question in her eyes. "Then perhaps, if you'd allow it, I could show you some of the safer parts of Pinyon tomorrow. There's a nice view from the ridge north of town, and Mrs. Patterson's cafe serves the best apple pie this side of the Mississippi." A blush rose in Fiona's cheeks, but she smiled warmly. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Vance. Ryder, please. Then you must call me Fiona." With a final nod, he stepped off the porch, an unfamiliar lightness in his chest as he walked back toward the heart of town. For the first time in years, Ryder Vance was looking forward to something other than the next job or the next paycheck. And that feeling, he realized with some surprise, was a welcome change. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the late summer sun casting long shadows across Pinyon as Ryder made his way to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. He'd taken unusual care with his appearance, wearing a freshly laundered shirt and his least worn pair of denims. He'd even visited the barber for a trim and a proper shave, earning a knowing smile from the old man, who rarely saw Ryder more than once a month. Mrs. Holloway answered his knock promptly, her eyes twinkling with undisguised interest as she ushered him into the parlor. "Miss Evans will be down shortly, Mr. Vance. She's quite looking forward to your tour of our little town." The older woman lowered her voice confidentially. "I must say, it does my heart good to see a gentleman taking an interest in our new teacher. Too many rough types in these mining towns, as yesterday's incident so tragically demonstrated." Before Ryder could respond to this not-so-subtle hint about his intentions, footsteps on the stairs announced Fiona's arrival. She wore a simple but becoming dress of sage green that complemented her fair coloring, her honey blonde hair neatly arranged beneath a modest straw hat. The bruises on her wrists from the ropes were hidden beneath long gloves, but Ryder noticed she winced slightly as she adjusted one. "Good morning, Mr. Vance Ryder," she corrected herself, a shy smile playing at her lips. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all," he assured her, momentarily struck by how lovely she looked in the morning light. He offered his arm. "Shall we begin our tour, Mrs.?" Holloway saw them off with a basket packed with sandwiches and a small jar of lemonade, her expression making it clear that while she approved of their outing, she expected proper behavior from both of them. "Remember, Miss Evans is due at the school board meeting at 4 o'clock, she reminded them pointedly. As they walked down Cedar Street toward the town center, Ryder was acutely aware of the curious glances they received from passers-by. News of yesterday's confrontation had spread through Pinyon like wildfire, and the sight of the mine's security man escorting the new schoolteacher was fresh fodder for the gossip mill. "I'm afraid we're causing quite a stir," Fiona commented, noticing his discomfort. "Is it going to cause trouble for you? Being seen with me, I mean." Ryder shook his head. "People will talk regardless of what we do or don't do. That's the nature of small towns. But no, it won't cause me any trouble." He guided her across the street, avoiding a particularly muddy patch. "If anything, being seen with someone as respectable as the town schoolteacher might improve my standing." This drew a laugh from Fiona. "And here I was worried my reputation might be damaged by association with a man who carries a gun for a living." "Touché, Miss Evans," he replied, grinning. It surprised him how easily conversation flowed between them, as though they'd known each other far longer than a day. Their first stop was the schoolhouse where Fiona would soon be teaching. It was a modest one-room building at the edge of town, recently constructed with funds from the silver mine owners who understood that attracting families to Pinyon meant providing education for children. "It's smaller than where I taught in Boston," Fiona remarked as they stood in the empty classroom. "But the essentials are the same. Children are children, whether in New England or New Mexico territory." Ryder watched as she moved about the room, straightening books on shelves and running her fingers over the smooth surface of the teacher's desk. There was something captivating about the way her face lit up when she talked about teaching. "How many students will you have?" he asked, genuinely interested. 23 at last count, ranging from 6 to 16 years old, she replied. "Some of the older boys only attend during the winter months when mining work slows down." She sighed. "That's something I hope to change." Education is so vital, especially for children growing up in frontier communities. "You really believe in what you're doing," Ryder observed. It wasn't a question. Fiona turned to face him, her expression earnest. "I do. My father used to say that books could take you places that even the fastest horse couldn't reach. I want to give these children that gift, the ability to travel through knowledge, to see beyond Pinyon." "Even though you yourself traveled all the way to Pinyon?" he asked with a slight smile. She laughed. "Precisely because I did. Books gave me the courage to come west to seek adventure beyond Boston's familiar streets." She glanced around the schoolroom once more. "What about you, Ryder? What brought you to Pinyon?" The question was innocent enough, but it touched on aspects of his past that Ryder rarely discussed. For a moment, he considered giving her the simplified version he offered to most people, that he'd drifted west like so many men seeking opportunity. But something about Fiona's open expression made him want to offer more of the truth. "I was a Texas Ranger before the war," he began, leaning against one of the student desks. "Spent 4 years fighting for the Confederacy, though I had little passion for the cause. When it ended, I couldn't go back to enforcing laws that seemed increasingly meaningless to me." He shrugged. "So I drifted, worked cattle drives, did some bounty hunting. Eventually got hired by the Silver Crescent Mining Company to protect their shipments and keep order among the miners." Fiona listened attentively, her blue eyes never leaving his face. "And do you like it? Your work here?" Ryder considered the question. "It pays well enough and I'm good at it, but—" He hesitated, surprising himself with his honesty. But I've been thinking lately that there must be more to life than standing guard over silver ore and breaking up fights between drunken miners. What would you rather be doing? She asked softly. The question caught him off guard. No one had asked him that in years, perhaps because he gave the impression of a man content with his lot. I bought a small parcel of land about 5 miles outside town, he admitted. It's not much, some pasture, a creek, a few trees. Been thinking about raising horses. Good horses, not just any nags, but animals with bloodlines and training. Fiona's face brightened. That sounds wonderful. Have you started building on your land yet? Just a rough cabin so far. I go out there sometimes on my days off, work on it bit by bit. He straightened up, suddenly self-conscious about sharing his modest dreams. But that's enough about me. You haven't seen the best parts of Pinyon yet. They continued their tour, with Ryder showing Fiona the general store, the telegraph office, and Mrs. Patterson's cafe, where they enjoyed the promised apple pie. Throughout the morning, Ryder found himself repeatedly charmed by Fiona's quick wit and genuine interest in everything and everyone they encountered. She asked thoughtful questions of the shopkeepers and greeted children playing in the street with warm smiles that were eagerly returned. By midday, they had covered most of the town, and Ryder suggested they ride to the ridge north of Pinyon for their picnic lunch. He borrowed a gentle mare from the livery stable for Fiona, relieved to discover she was an accomplished rider. My grandfather had a country estate outside Boston where I spent summers as a child, she explained as they rode side by side along the trail. He insisted all his grandchildren learn to ride properly, said it built character. The view from the ridge was spectacular, offering a panoramic vista of the valley below with Pinyon nestled against the foothills and the distant mountains rising majestically against the azure sky. They spread Mrs. Holloway's picnic on a flat rock and sat enjoying the gentle breeze that made the late summer heat bearable. It's beautiful, Fiona said, gazing out at the landscape. So different from New England, but beautiful in its own way. There's a vastness to it that makes you feel both insignificant and infinite at the same time. Ryder nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. That's what drew me to the West initially. The space, the freedom of it. Back east, it always felt like someone was looking over my shoulder, measuring me against some standard I couldn't quite grasp. Yes, Fiona exclaimed. That's it exactly. In Boston, everything is so prescribed: who you can speak to, what you can do, how you should behave. She plucked a wildflower growing beside the rock, twirling it between her fingers. My mother was horrified when I announced I was coming west to teach. She said I'd end up murdered by Indians or married to some uncouth miner with dirt under his fingernails. Ryder glanced down at his own hands, which despite his morning ablution still bore the ingrained marks of hard work. Fiona followed his gaze and immediately looked mortified. Oh, I didn't mean that is. I wasn't implying, she broke off, blushing furiously. My mother's views are not my own, obviously. To her evident relief, Ryder laughed. No offense taken. And your mother's not entirely wrong about the dangers out here, as you discovered yesterday, though the Blackwells pose a far greater threat than any of the local tribes these days. The mention of the previous day's events sobered them both. Fiona unconsciously rubbed her wrists where the ropes had chafed her skin. Do you really think they'll come back? For revenge, I mean. Ryder considered this carefully. Silas Blackwell has a reputation for holding grudges, but he's also a survivor. With his brother wounded and the law alerted to their activities, the smart move would be to lie low for a while, maybe move their operation elsewhere. He looked at her directly. But I won't lie to you, it's possible they might return. Which is why I've arranged for Deputy Myers to keep an eye on the boarding house for the next few weeks, just as a precaution. Fiona's expression softened. You've been very thoughtful, Ryder, thank you. They lapsed into comfortable silence, enjoying the view and the simple pleasure of each other's company. As they packed up the remains of their picnic, Ryder found himself reluctant for the day to end. There was something about Fiona Evans that intrigued him on a level he hadn't experienced before, a complexity beneath her proper exterior that called to something equally complex within himself. "Your land," Fiona said suddenly, as they mounted their horses for the return journey. "Is it far from here?" "About 3 miles that way," Ryder replied, pointing northwest. "Why do you ask?" She hesitated, then smiled. "I'd like to see it someday. Your future horse ranch, if you wouldn't mind showing me, that is." The request surprised and pleased him. "I'd be happy to. Though I should warn you, it's very much a work in progress. The cabin is habitable but hardly comfortable." "All great things start as works in progress," Fiona replied, her eyes twinkling. "Including us, I suppose." The simple phrase, "including us," sent a warmth spreading through Ryder's chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. As they rode back toward Pinyon, he found himself sharing more details about his plans for the land, the stable he intended to build, the breeding stock he hoped to acquire, the house that would eventually replace the rough cabin. Dreams he'd rarely voiced aloud suddenly seemed more tangible when shared with Fiona. They returned to town with just enough time for Fiona to freshen up before her meeting with the school board. As Ryder helped her down from her horse outside the boarding house, their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today," Fiona said softly. "It was exactly what I needed after yesterday's unpleasantness." "The pleasure was mine," Ryder replied, meaning it more than he'd expected to. "Perhaps, if you're not too busy with school preparations, we could do something similar again before your term starts." The smile that lit up Fiona's face was answer enough, but she nodded for good measure. "I'd like that very much." As Ryder watched her walk up the path to Mrs. Holloway's front door, he was struck by the realization that in just 2 days, Fiona Evans had somehow managed to awaken possibilities in him that he'd long since dismissed, possibilities of connection, of purpose beyond his current existence, perhaps even of love. The thought should have terrified him, but instead, he found himself smiling as he turned to lead the horses back to the livery stable. In the days that followed, Ryder and Fiona fell into a comfortable pattern. He would escort her to the schoolhouse each morning, where she prepared for the upcoming term, organizing books and supplies, writing lesson plans, and meeting with parents eager to introduce themselves to Pinyon's new teacher. In the afternoons, they would often walk together, sometimes stopping at Mrs. Patterson's cafe for pie, other times simply enjoying each other's company as they explored the town and its surroundings. 5 days after their first outing, Ryder finally took Fiona to see his land. The late August day was gloriously clear, with just enough breeze to keep the heat tolerable as they rode northwest from town. Ryder found himself increasingly nervous as they approached his property, suddenly seeing it through Fiona's eyes: the unfinished cabin, the crude corral, the general air of a project barely begun. "It's not much to look at yet," he cautioned as they crested the final rise that revealed the small valley he'd purchased. "But the creek never runs dry, even in summer, and the grass is good for horses." Fiona reined her mare to a stop beside him, taking in the view with evident appreciation. "It's lovely, Ryder, truly. I can see exactly why you chose this spot." The property's natural beauty was undeniable: a gentle valley nestled between 2 low ridges, with a clear creek winding through stands of cottonwood and willow. The cabin sat on a slight rise near the creek, its rough-hewn logs weathering to a silver gray in the New Mexico sun. A small corral stood nearby, currently empty except for the single gelding that Ryder kept on the property for when he stayed overnight. They dismounted and secured their horses, and Ryder gave Fiona a tour of his modest holdings, increasingly pleased by her genuine enthusiasm. She didn't see the project's current shortcomings, but rather its potential exactly as he did. "And you're building all this yourself?" she asked as they examined the cabin, which consisted of a main room with a stone fireplace and a small bedroom partitioned off at the back. Ryder nodded. "When I have time. The mine keeps me busy, but I get out here at least 1 day a week. Been slowly gathering materials for a proper stable." He gestured toward a pile of lumber stacked under a tarp. "Come spring, I plan to start on the main house. Nothing fancy, but something more substantial than this." Fiona ran her hand along the cabin's doorframe, which Ryder had carefully planed smooth. "You're quite skilled. Did you learn carpentry before coming west?" "My father was a carpenter," he explained, surprised at how easily the personal details were flowing when he usually kept them guarded. "Taught me the basics before I left home. The rest I picked up along the way." They sat on the cabin's small porch, sharing the lunch they'd brought and watching as a red-tailed hawk circled lazily overhead. The easy silence between them was comfortable, punctuated only by the gentle gurgle of the creek and the occasional whicker from the horses. "I can see you here," Fiona said suddenly, her blue eyes thoughtful as she gazed out over the valley. "Building something real, something lasting." Her words touched something deep within him. "That's the plan, been drifting too long." He hesitated, then added, "What about you? Is Pinyon just a stop on your journey west, or do you plan to put down roots?" Fiona considered the question seriously. "I signed a 2-year contract with the school board, but beyond that." She shrugged, a small smile playing at her lips. "I suppose it depends on what keeps me here. The school, the community, the people." Her eyes met his briefly before returning to the view. The implication wasn't lost on Ryder, and it sent a surge of hope through him that was as unexpected as it was powerful. Before he could respond, however, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Ryder was immediately alert, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip as he stood. "Stay here," he instructed Fiona, his voice low and serious. Strangers riding onto his property unannounced was unusual and potentially dangerous, especially with the Blackwells still at large. But as the riders came into view, 3 men on horseback, approaching from the direction of Pinyon, Ryder relaxed slightly. He recognized the lead rider as Deputy Myers from the sheriff's office, though the other 2 men were unfamiliar. "Vance," Myers called as they drew closer. "Thought we might find you out here." Ryder stepped off the porch, positioning himself between the approaching riders and Fiona, who had risen to stand in the cabin doorway. "What brings you all this way, Deputy?" Myers reined his horse to a stop, nodding respectfully to Fiona before turning his attention back to Ryder. "Got word from Las Cruces this morning. The Blackwells hit a stagecoach near Alamogordo yesterday, killed the driver and a passenger, made off with the strongbox." Ryder felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "All 3 of them, just Silas and the youngest from the descriptions. Seems the middle brother didn't survive his wounds from your encounter." Myers glanced at Fiona, his expression grim. "Sheriff thought you both should know. Silas was heard making threats about Pinyon, specifically about settling scores with you, Vance, and, well, with Miss Evans here." Fiona stepped forward, her face pale but composed. "He mentioned me specifically?" Myers shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Yes, madam. Afraid so. A witness at the stagecoach robbery heard him say something about the schoolteacher who cost him his brother. Sheriff's taking it seriously enough that he asked me to find you and suggest you both return to town where he can keep an eye on things." Ryder's mind was already racing through the implications. Silas Blackwell was vindictive and dangerous under normal circumstances. Driven by grief over his brother and a thirst for revenge, he would be even more unpredictable. "We'll head back now," Ryder decided, turning to Fiona. "I'm sorry about this." She nodded, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. "Of course, we should go." Within minutes, they had saddled up and were riding back toward Pinion, flanked by Myers and the two deputies. Ryder kept close to Fiona, his senses on high alert as they traveled. He couldn't help but feel that their idyllic afternoon had been shattered, not just by the interruption, but by the reminder that danger still lurked on the horizon. When they reached Pinion, Sheriff Donovan was waiting for them at his office, his weathered face creased with concern as Myers related their conversation. "I've put extra men on patrol," the sheriff informed them, "and sent telegrams to every town within 50 miles to be on the lookout for the Blackwells. But until they're caught—" He looked directly at Fiona. "Miss Evans, I'd advise you not to go anywhere alone, not even during daylight hours." Fiona nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I understand, Sheriff, but school starts in 2 days. I can't possibly cancel or delay it because of threats against me personally." "No one's suggesting you should," Donovan assured her. "But we'll arrange for someone to escort you to and from the schoolhouse, and I'll have a deputy check in regularly during school hours." "I'll take responsibility for Miss Evans' safety," Ryder interjected firmly. "My contract with the mine gives me some flexibility, and they'll understand the circumstances." The sheriff looked relieved. "That would be helpful, Vance. No offense to my deputies, but you've faced the Blackwells before and lived to tell about it." After further discussion of security measures, Ryder escorted Fiona back to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, both of them quiet, lost in their own thoughts about this new development. On the porch, before she went inside, Fiona finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry, Ryder. This is all because of me." "If you hadn't helped me that day, don't," he interrupted gently. "Don't apologize for something that's not your fault. The Blackwells are outlaws who have hurt plenty of innocent people. What happened to the middle brother, that was his choice, not yours." Fiona sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. "I know you're right, but I hate that I've brought this danger to Pinion and especially to you." "Fiona," Ryder said, taking her hand impulsively, "listen to me. I don't regret what I did that day, not for a second." His voice softened. "Meeting you has been. Well, it's been the best thing that's happened to me in a long time. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The smile she gave him was tremulous but genuine. "Together," she echoed, squeezing his hand. "Thank you, Ryder, for everything." As Ryder walked back to his small room above the livery stable that night, his mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions. Concern for Fiona's safety warred with a growing certainty about his feelings for her. In just a week, she had become inexplicably important to him, her smile, her intelligence, her courage in the face of adversity. The threat posed by the Blackwells only crystallized what he was already beginning to realize. He was falling in love with Fiona Evans. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to care so deeply about another person, years of keeping everyone at arm's length while he drifted from job to job, place to place. Now, faced with the prospect of losing Fiona either to danger or simply to her eventual departure from Pinion, he was forced to confront just how much she had come to mean to him. Lying in his narrow bed, listening to the horses shifting in their stalls below, Ryder made a decision. Once the Blackwell threat was eliminated, he would tell Fiona how he felt. And whatever her response, he would finally commit to the future he'd been planning: the horse ranch, a permanent home, roots in one place. With or without her, it was time to stop drifting. But first, he had to ensure her safety, and that meant being prepared for Silas Blackwell's inevitable return. The next 2 days passed in a tense sort of normalcy. True to his word, Ryder escorted Fiona to and from the schoolhouse, where she continued her preparations for the start of term. The school board arranged for additional locks on the schoolhouse doors and shutters for the window security measures that saddened Fiona, but which she recognized as necessary under the circumstances. "It's not how I imagined my first teaching position in the West," she admitted to Ryder as they walked back to the boarding house on the eve of the school's opening, "turning a place of learning into a fortress." "It's temporary," he assured her, though in truth, he had no way of knowing how long the threat would linger. "Once the Blackwells are caught, things can go back to normal." Fiona nodded, but he could see the strain in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. Despite her brave front, the situation was taking its toll on her. Impulsively, he changed their course, steering them toward Mrs. Patterson's cafe instead of directly to the boarding house. "What are we doing?" Fiona asked, puzzled by the detour. "Getting apple pie," Ryder replied with a smile. "If I recall correctly, you said it was the best remedy for frayed nerves." Her laugh was genuine, if a bit shaky. "I did say that, didn't I? Apple pie it is, then, over slices of Mrs. Patterson's famous dessert." They spoke of lighter topics: Fiona's lesson plans for her diverse group of students, Ryder's latest improvements to his cabin, books they had both read and enjoyed. For a little while, it was possible to forget the shadow hanging over them and simply enjoy each other's company. As they finished their pie, Mrs. Patterson herself stopped by their table, her round face creased in a maternal smile. "It does my heart good to see young people enjoying themselves, especially with all this nasty business going on." She lowered her voice confidentially. "The whole town's behind you too, you know. Those Blackwell scoundrels won't find any friends or hiding places in Pinyon, not after what they tried to do to our new schoolteacher." Ryder was touched by the older woman's support, and by her casual inclusion of him alongside Fiona as someone the town valued. It was a novel sensation for a man who'd spent most of his adult life on the periphery of communities rather than as part of them. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson," Fiona said warmly. "Your kindness, everyone's kindness, has meant so much to me during this difficult time." As they left the cafe, the sun was setting behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across Pinyon's main street. Most businesses were closing up for the day, shopkeepers and clerks heading home to their families. The evening had a peaceful quality that almost made it possible to believe that no danger lurked on the horizon. Almost, but not quite. Ryder remained vigilant as they walked, his eyes scanning doorways and alleys, his hand never far from his holstered gun. He'd survived as long as he had in dangerous professions by never letting down his guard, and he wasn't about to start now, not with Fiona's safety at stake. They reached Mrs. Holloway's boarding house without incident, and Ryder saw Fiona safely inside with promises to return at dawn to escort her to the schoolhouse for her first day of teaching. As he turned to leave, she caught his arm. "Ryder, wait." Her blue eyes were serious in the lamp-lit foyer. "I want you to know, whatever happens tomorrow or the next day or the next, these past days with you have been wonderful. I don't regret a moment of them." The simple sincerity of her words caught him off guard, warming something deep inside him. "Neither do I," he replied softly. "Not a single moment." Their eyes held for a long beat, and Ryder found himself leaning slightly toward her, drawn by something powerful and undeniable. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though Fiona might close the distance between them, her lips parting slightly as she tilted her face up to his. The sound of Mrs. Holloway's footsteps in the hallway broke the spell. Fiona stepped back, a blush coloring her cheeks as the older woman appeared with a knowing smile. "Miss Evans, your dinner is ready," Mrs. Holloway announced, nodding politely to Ryder. "Good evening, Mr. Vance. Will we see you in the morning?" "Yes, madam. First light," he confirmed, tipping his hat to both women before stepping back onto the porch. As the door closed behind him, Ryder exhaled slowly, his heart racing from what had almost happened and from the realization of how much he wanted it to happen. Tomorrow, he decided. After Fiona's first day of teaching was successfully behind her, he would find a moment to speak to her privately, to tell her what was in his heart. Life was too uncertain, too precious, to waste another day without letting her know how he felt. With that resolution firmly in mind, Ryder walked back to his lodgings above the livery, unaware that fate had other plans for what tomorrow would bring. The first day of school in Pinyon dawned bright and clear, with just enough autumn crispness in the early morning air to hint at the changing seasons. Ryder arrived at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house before sunrise, having slept poorly due to a combination of anticipation and concern. He found Fiona already waiting on the porch, dressed in a high-necked blue dress that emphasized her eyes, her hair neatly arranged beneath a modest hat. "You're early," she greeted him with a smile that didn't quite mask the nervousness in her expression. "Couldn't sleep either." "Too much on my mind," Ryder admitted, offering his arm. "Ready for your first day, teacher?" Fiona took his arm, her touch light but steady. "As ready as I'll ever be. 23 students of varying ages and abilities, all looking to me for guidance. What could possibly go wrong?" Her self-deprecating humor made him chuckle. "You'll be wonderful. Those children are lucky to have you." They walked to the schoolhouse in the growing light of dawn, Fiona chattering somewhat anxiously about her lesson plans and classroom arrangements. Ryder listened attentively, enjoying the animation in her face and the passion in her voice when she spoke about teaching. By the time they reached the schoolhouse, the sun was fully up, casting a golden glow over the simple wooden building. "I'll check inside first," Ryder said, his hand moving to his revolver out of habit. Despite the tranquility of the morning, he wasn't taking any chances with Fiona's safety. The schoolhouse was empty, its single room neat and orderly just as Fiona had left it the previous afternoon. Desks were arranged in rows facing the teacher's desk. A blackboard hung on the wall behind it, and shelves of books lined the side wall. Ryder checked the small cloakroom and storage closet as well before signaling to Fiona that all was clear. "I'll be right outside all day," he assured her as she settled her things on the desk. "Sheriff's sending Deputy Myers to check in every hour or so as well." Fiona nodded, her fingers nervously straightening an already perfectly aligned stack of primers. "It seems excessive, doesn't it? All this security for a schoolteacher." "Better excessive than insufficient," Ryder replied firmly. "At least until we know the Blackwells are no longer a threat." She sighed, then visibly straightened her shoulders. "You're right, of course, and I'm grateful, truly." Her smile became more genuine. "Now go on outside before my students arrive. It wouldn't do for the fearsome Mr. Vance to intimidate them on their first day." Ryder grinned at her teasing. "Fearsome, am I? Absolutely terrifying," Fiona assured him with a twinkle in her eye. "Now shoo, let me prepare to welcome my class." As Ryder stepped outside onto the schoolhouse porch, he couldn't help but marvel at Fiona's resilience. Despite the danger hanging over her, she was determined to fulfill her duties as a teacher, to make her first day special for her students. It was just one more thing to admire about her, one more reason his feelings continued to deepen with each day that passed. The students began arriving shortly before 8 o'clock, some on foot, others on horseback or in wagons with their parents. Each family had been briefed by the school board about the security measures, so no one seemed surprised to see Ryder standing guard. Several fathers nodded approvingly as they dropped off their children, and a few mothers thanked him directly for protecting their teacher. By 8 o'clock, all 23 students were inside, and the sound of Fiona's clear voice leading them in a morning song drifted through the open windows. Ryder settled into his vigil, positioned where he could see both the road approaching the schoolhouse and all sides of the building itself. Deputy Myers arrived as promised an hour later, reporting no unusual activity in or around Pinyon. The morning passed peacefully. At noon, the children spilled outside for lunch and playtime, their exuberant energy a stark contrast to the tension of the past few days. Fiona joined Ryder on the porch, her cheeks flushed with excitement as she watched her students playing tag and other games in the schoolyard. "How's it going?" he asked, enjoying the happiness radiating from her. "Wonderfully," she replied with genuine enthusiasm. "They're bright, eager to learn, and so responsive. Even Tommy Wilson, who his mother warned me might be difficult, has been a perfect gentleman." She nodded toward a lanky boy of about 12 who was organizing a game of catch among the older boys, and no sign of trouble. Ryder asked, more out of habit than real concern given the tranquility of the day. Fiona shook her head. "None at all. Perhaps the Blackwells have decided we're not worth the effort after all." "Perhaps," Ryder agreed, though inwardly he was less optimistic. Men like Silas Blackwell didn't simply let go of grudges, especially not when those grudges involved the death of a brother. The afternoon session resumed without incident, and at 3 o'clock, the students were dismissed. Parents arrived to collect the younger children, while the older ones set off in groups for their homes in town or on outlying farms and ranches. Within half an hour, the schoolyard was empty except for Ryder and Fiona. "A successful first day," Ryder observed as Fiona locked the schoolhouse door behind them. "No unruly students, no outlaw attacks. I'd call that a victory." Fiona laughed, the sound light and carefree for the first time in days. "A resounding victory, and tomorrow will be even better." She tucked her arm through his as they began walking back toward town. "I think I've earned that apple pie you promised me." Ryder smiled down at her, struck once again by how quickly she had become essential to his happiness. "Apple pie it is, and perhaps. Afterward, there's something I'd like to talk to you about." Fiona looked up at him curiously, but before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Ryder tensed, automatically moving to place himself between Fiona and potential danger, his hand dropping to his holstered gun. But it was only Sheriff Donovan and Deputy Myers riding toward them from town. "Afternoon, Miss Evans Vance," the sheriff called as they drew closer. "Just wanted to check how the first day of school went." "Smoothly, Sheriff, thank you," Fiona replied. "The children were wonderful, and as you can see, there's been no sign of trouble." Donovan nodded, though his expression remained serious. "Glad to hear it. But I'm afraid there's been a development." He dismounted, handing his reins to Myers before approaching them. "Got a telegram from Santa Fe this morning. Seems Silas and the younger Blackwell robbed a bank there yesterday. 2 men killed, including a deputy." Ryder felt Fiona stiffen beside him. "They're moving north then," he observed grimly. "Closer to Pinyon." "That's how we read it too," the sheriff confirmed. "Which is why I've asked the territorial governor for additional lawmen. Should have at least 4 extra deputies by tomorrow or the next day." "That's reassuring," Fiona said, though her voice betrayed her renewed anxiety. Sheriff Donovan looked at her sympathetically. "Miss Evans, I don't want to alarm you unduly, but I'd feel better if you stayed somewhere less obvious than Mrs. Holloway's boarding house for the next few nights. Somewhere the Blackwells wouldn't immediately look for you if they do make it to Pinyon." Ryder immediately saw the wisdom in this suggestion. "She could stay at my place outside town," he offered. "It's isolated enough to be secure, but close enough that we could get help if needed." The sheriff considered this, stroking his mustache thoughtfully. "Not a bad idea. Blackwells wouldn't know to look for her there." He turned to Fiona. "What do you think, Miss Evans? It wouldn't be as comfortable as Mrs. Holloway's, I imagine, but it might be safer in the short term." Fiona hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and safety. I I suppose it would be the sensible option, she finally conceded. But what about school? I can't simply abandon my students. No one's suggesting that, Ryder assured her. We can ride in together each morning and back each evening. It's only a temporary measure, until the Blackwells are caught. After further discussion, it was agreed that Fiona would return to the boarding house just long enough to pack a few necessities before accompanying Ryder to his homestead. The sheriff would inform Mrs. Holloway of the arrangement personally, emphasizing its temporary and necessary nature to prevent any damage to Fiona's reputation. As Ryder and Fiona continued their walk to town, now flanked by the sheriff and his deputy, Ryder couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions about the new arrangement. Concern for Fiona's safety was foremost, of course, but there was also an undeniable anticipation at the prospect of showing her more of his land, of sharing his modest home with her, even under these strained circumstances. "I'm sorry the cabin isn't more suitable for a lady," he said quietly as they approached the boarding house. "It's pretty basic accommodations." Fiona glanced up at him, a small smile playing at her lips despite the seriousness of the situation. Ryder Vance, after crossing half the country by stagecoach and surviving an attempted kidnapping, I think I can manage a few nights in a cabin. Besides, her smile widened slightly. I've seen it, remember, it's perfectly charming. Her ability to find brightness even in dark situations continued to amaze him. As they mounted the steps to Mrs. Holloway's front porch, Ryder made a silent vow to himself. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he would keep Fiona safe. The Blackwells would not harm her, not while he had breath in his body to prevent it. What Ryder couldn't know, as they stepped into the boarding house to explain the situation to Mrs. Holloway, was that Silas Blackwell and his younger brother were already much closer than anyone suspected. And their plans for revenge were about to be set in motion. Mrs. Holloway took the news of Fiona's temporary relocation with surprising equanimity. After an initial expression of concern about propriety, the sheriff's grave explanation of the danger convinced her of the necessity. "Well, I suppose it can't be helped," she conceded with a sigh. "Better safe than sorry, as my dear departed husband used to say." She fixed Ryder with a stern look. "I trust you to behave as a gentleman, Mr. Vance. Miss Evans is under your protection, not at your disposal." "Yes, madam," Ryder replied solemnly, suppressing a smile at the older woman's bluntness. "Her safety is my only concern." While Fiona went upstairs to pack a small valise, Mrs. Holloway insisted on preparing a basket of food for them to take to the cabin. "Can't have you two going hungry out there in the wilderness," she declared, bustling about her kitchen. "And I imagine your larder is rather sparse, Mr. Vance, being a bachelor and all." Ryder accepted the basket gratefully when it was ready, knowing that his supplies at the cabin were indeed limited. The sheriff and Deputy Myers agreed to remain at the boarding house until Fiona was ready, then escort them partway to the homestead to ensure they weren't followed. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they finally set out, Fiona now dressed in a simpler outfit more suitable for riding. They traveled in silence initially, all four riders alert for any sign of trouble. About halfway to Ryder's property, the sheriff and his deputy turned back, satisfied that the way ahead was clear. "We'll see you at the schoolhouse tomorrow morning," Sheriff Donovan promised before they parted. "And Vance, take good care of her." Ryder nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility being placed on his shoulders. "With my life, Sheriff." As they continued on alone, the tension gradually eased from Fiona's shoulders, and she began to look around with interest at the landscape they were passing through. The approaching sunset painted the hills and valleys in shades of gold and crimson, casting long shadows across the trail. "It's beautiful out here," she observed, breathing deeply of the sage-scented air. So peaceful compared to town. Ryder nodded, pleased that she could appreciate the stark beauty of the New Mexico landscape. That's why I chose this land, far enough from town to have some solitude but close enough to be practical. When they reached his property, the cabin looked more welcoming than Ryder had expected. The setting sun gilded the rough-hewn logs, and the chimney promised warmth against the cooling evening air. The single gelding in the corral nickered a greeting as they approached, trotting over to the fence to investigate the newcomers. "That's Rusty," Ryder explained as he helped Fiona dismount. "First horse I bought for the ranch. He's getting on in years, but he's good company when I'm out here alone." Fiona approached the corral, speaking softly to the chestnut gelding who extended his nose curiously toward her. "He's lovely," she said, gently stroking the white blaze on his face. Gentle eyes. Ryder watched her with the horse, struck once again by the natural grace she brought to every interaction. After a moment, he shook himself from his reverie and set about taking care of their mounts, unsaddling and rubbing them down before turning them into the corral with Rusty. Fiona insisted on helping, and Ryder found himself enjoying the simple domestic rhythm of working alongside her. Inside, the cabin was just as Spartan as Ryder had warned: a main room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs, plus the small bedroom partitioned off at the back. But he'd swept it clean before leaving that morning, and the windows let in the last golden rays of the setting sun, giving the space a warm glow. "You take the bedroom," Ryder said immediately, setting Fiona's valise and Mrs. Holloway's food basket on the table. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." Fiona looked as though she might protest, but then nodded. "Thank you, though I feel as though I'm imposing terribly." "Not at all," Ryder assured her, already moving to light the lantern hanging by the door. "I'm glad to have the company and gladder still to know you're safe." He paused, then added more quietly, "The idea of you staying in town, an easy target for the Blackwells. It doesn't bear thinking about." Fiona's expression softened at his admission. "You've done so much for me, Ryder. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "There's nothing to repay," he replied simply. "It's what anyone would do for." He hesitated, not quite ready to put his feelings into words. "For a friend," he finished, though the term seemed woefully inadequate for what Fiona had become to him. A comfortable silence fell between them as Ryder built a fire in the hearth while Fiona unpacked the food Mrs. Holloway had sent. The domesticity of the scene preparing a meal together in his cabin as night fell outside stirred something profound in Ryder. It was a glimpse of the life he'd been slowly building toward, the future he hoped for. And seeing Fiona as part of that vision felt right in a way that both thrilled and terrified him. They ate by firelight, sharing stories from their respective days: Fiona's experiences with her new students, Ryder's observations about the town's response to the Blackwell threat. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned more personal, touching on childhood memories, books they'd read, dreams they harbored. "I always wanted to see the ocean," Fiona admitted as they lingered over cups of coffee. "Growing up in Boston, it was right there, but somehow I never made it to the shore. And now here I am, about as far from any ocean as a person can get in this country." She laughed softly at the irony. "We could go someday," Ryder said impulsively. "To California, maybe, see the Pacific." The words hung in the air between them, laden with implication of future together, journeys shared. Fiona's eyes reflected the firelight as she looked at him. "I'd like that," she said quietly, and Ryder felt something shift between them, a barrier lowering, a possibility opening. The moment was interrupted by a sound outside, a horse whickering, followed by the snap of a twig. Ryder was on his feet in an instant, revolver in hand, moving silently to the window. "What is it?" Fiona whispered, fear evident in her voice. "Probably nothing," Ryder replied softly, peering out into the darkness. "But stay down, away from the windows." The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see the corral and the approach to the cabin. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, just at the edge of visibility, a shadow detached itself from the trees, a figure on horseback, followed by another. Blackwell's, Ryder breathed, his worst fears confirmed. Somehow they'd found out about his property, about Fiona's location. "There are two of them, approaching from the east." Fiona had gone very pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "What do we do?" Ryder's mind raced through their options. The cabin wasn't built to withstand an attack. The walls were solid enough, but the windows were vulnerable, and there was only the one door. They could try to make a run for it, but in the open country, they'd be easy targets. "We need to hold them off until morning," he decided. "The sheriff will come looking for us when we don't show up at the schoolhouse." He moved quickly to the bedroom, pulling a shotgun from under the bed and checking that it was loaded. "Take this," he told Fiona, pressing it into her hands. "Only as a last resort." Her fingers closed around the weapon, her expression resolute despite the fear in her eyes. "I've never fired a gun before," she admitted. "Point and pull the trigger," Ryder instructed grimly. "It doesn't take much aim at close range." He moved back to the window, calculating distances and angles. "They're still holding back, probably trying to figure out if we know they're here." Suddenly, a voice called out from the darkness. "Vance, we know you're in there, and we know you've got the teacher with you. Come on out, and maybe we won't burn this place to the ground with both of you inside it." Silas Blackwell's distinctive rasp carried clearly in the still night air. Ryder exchanged a glance with Fiona, silently communicating that they should remain silent. "Have it your way," Silas called after a moment of waiting. "But remember, we offered you a chance." The crack of a rifle shot punctuated his words, the bullet splintering the wooden frame of the window where Ryder stood. He ducked down, pulling Fiona with him to the floor. "They're going to try to force us out," he said urgently. "We need to be ready when they make their move." For the next hour, an intermittent exchange of gunfire kept them pinned down inside the cabin. Ryder managed a few shots through the windows whenever he caught glimpses of movement, but the Blackwells were canny, using the darkness to their advantage, firing from different positions to keep them guessing. During a lull in the shooting, Fiona touched Ryder's arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "This is all because of me." Ryder shook his head firmly. "No, it's because the Blackwells are outlaws who can't stand that someone stood up to them. None of this is your fault." A sudden change in the quality of the light outside caught Ryder's attention. The faint glow of flames flickered against the trees at the edge of the clearing. "They're starting a fire," he realized with a sinking feeling, "trying to smoke us out." The flames spread quickly, feeding on the dry brush near the edge of the trees. Within minutes, the smoke was visible, drifting toward the cabin on the light breeze. "We can't stay here," Ryder decided. "When the fire reaches the cabin, we'll be trapped." He looked around frantically, searching for options. "There's a root cellar under the floor," he suddenly remembered. "It's small, just for storing supplies, but it might give us a chance." Moving quickly, he rolled back the rug near the fireplace, revealing a trapdoor in the wooden floor. Pulling it open revealed a shallow space beneath, barely large enough for two people to crouch in, with earthen walls and a dirt floor. "Go down," he urged Fiona. "I'll cover our retreat, then join you." Fiona hesitated. "We'll be trapped down there if they find us." "Better than being shot or burned alive," Ryder countered grimly. "Please, Fiona, trust me." After a moment's more hesitation, she nodded and began lowering herself into the dark space. Ryder fired several more shots through the windows to keep the Blackwells at bay, then quickly joined her in the cellar, pulling the trapdoor closed above them and sliding a bolt into place to secure it from below. The space was cramped and dark, smelling of earth and the few root vegetables Ryder had stored there. They huddled close together, listening to the sounds above the crackle of approaching flames, occasional gunshots, and then, most terrifyingly, the thud of boots on the cabin floor. "They're inside," Fiona whispered, her body tense against Ryder's in the confined space. He nodded, though she couldn't see him in the darkness, and placed a finger against her lips, a silent plea for absolute quiet. Above them, the Blackwells moved around the cabin, their footsteps creaking on the wooden floor mere inches from where Ryder and Fiona hid. "They ain't here, Silas," the younger Blackwell's voice came, tinged with confusion. "Must have slipped out somehow." "Impossible," Silas snarled. "We've been watching all sides. Check again." For heart-stopping minutes, they listened to the thorough search of the small cabin. At one point, Boots walked directly over the trapdoor, and Ryder felt Fiona's hand find his in the darkness, squeezing tightly. He returned the pressure, trying to convey reassurance he didn't entirely feel. Finally, the footsteps receded. "The fire's getting too close," the younger Blackwell said urgently. "We need to go, Silas." "Not without finding them," Silas insisted, his voice tight with frustrated rage. "They must have left before we got here," his brother argued. "Come on, we can try again tomorrow. They'll have to show up in town eventually." A long pause followed, then the sound of Silas spitting on the floor. "Fine, but this isn't over, not by a long shot." The relief Ryder felt at hearing the Blackwells leave was short-lived. The smell of smoke was growing stronger, seeping through the cracks around the trapdoor. The fire they'd started was reaching the cabin. "We need to get out of here," he told Fiona urgently. "The cabin's catching fire." "But the Blackwells, hopefully they're far enough away by now, we'll have to risk it. We can't stay here and burn." Cautiously, Ryder slid back the bolt and pushed up on the trapdoor. Smoke immediately billowed down into the cellar, making them both cough. The main room of the cabin was filled with it, the far wall already engulfed in flames that were spreading rapidly to the roof. "Stay low," Ryder instructed, pulling himself up and then helping Fiona out of the cellar. "And move fast." Crouching below the worst of the smoke, they made their way to the door. Ryder paused before opening it, peering carefully through a crack to ensure the Blackwells weren't lying in wait outside. Seeing no immediate threat, he pushed the door open, and they stumbled out into the blessedly clean night air. The cabin was burning fiercely now, the dry timber catching quickly. Ryder spared a moment's regret for the simple home he'd built with his own hands, before turning his attention to their more pressing concern, getting to safety, before the Blackwells realized they'd emerged. "The horses," Fiona said suddenly, pointing toward the corral where the animals were growing increasingly agitated by the fire. Ryder nodded and they ran to the corral. The horses were whinnying nervously, tossing their heads as they eyed the growing blaze. Ryder quickly caught his gelding and Fiona's mare, saddling them with practiced speed while Fiona soothed the frightened animals. "We'll head west," Ryder decided as he helped Fiona mount. "There's a line shack about 5 miles that way, belongs to the Mackenzie Ranch. We can shelter there for the night." They rode hard through the darkness, neither speaking, both acutely aware that the Blackwells might still be nearby. The burning cabin receded behind them, its glow visible for miles across the open country. Ryder led them on a circuitous route, doubling back occasionally to ensure they weren't being followed, before finally turning toward the line shack he'd mentioned. It was well past midnight when they finally reached it, a simple one-room structure used by cowboys working the outlying ranges of the Mackenzie spread. It was empty, as Ryder had expected this time of year, and while it offered little in the way of comfort, it was secure and far from the burning remains of his own cabin. As they unsaddled the horses and settled them for what remained of the night, the adrenaline that had carried them through their escape began to fade. leaving both Ryder and Fiona shaky with delayed reaction to their narrow brush with death. Inside the shack, Ryder managed to light a small fire in the crude stone fireplace, its warm glow illuminating Fiona's pale face as she sank onto a rough wooden bench, trembling slightly. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling before her, his eyes searching her face with concern. She shook her head. "No, just processing everything that happened." She looked up at him, her blue eyes wide in the firelight. "They burned your home, Ryder, because of me, everything you've worked for." "It was just a cabin," he said firmly, taking her hands in his. "It can be rebuilt. You can't be replaced." The words were out before he could consider them, revealing more of his feelings than he'd intended. Fiona's gaze held his, something shifting in her expression. "You really mean that, don't you?" "Yes," Ryder replied simply, no longer seeing any reason to hide the truth. "Fiona, these past days with you, they've meant more to me than I can say. When I thought we might not make it out of that cellar alive, my only regret was not telling you how I feel." She drew a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around his. "And how do you feel, Ryder Vance?" The moment stretched between them, fraught with possibility. Ryder had faced danger countless times in his life: gunfights, stampedes, blizzards, but nothing had ever terrified him as much as this moment of vulnerability. "I'm falling in love with you," he finally said, his voice low and steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I know it's too soon, and I know there are 100 reasons why it's impractical, but—" Fiona cut him off, pressing her fingers gently against his lips. "It's not too soon," she whispered. "Not when you feel like home to me already." The simple declaration undid him completely. With a soft groan, Ryder closed the distance between them, his lips finding hers in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened as Fiona's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Ryder rested his forehead against hers. "I'll keep you safe," he promised. "And when this is over, when the Blackwells are no longer a threat, I want to build a life with you, Fiona, if you'll have me." Her smile was radiant in the firelight. "I can't imagine anything I want more." They spent the remainder of the night in the lined shack, talking softly of dreams and plans, stealing kisses, and finding comfort in each other's presence, despite the danger still lurking beyond the walls. As dawn approached, they reluctantly prepared to return to Pinyon, knowing that the sheriff would be concerned by their failure to appear. "What will we tell everyone?" Fiona asked as they saddled the horses, the eastern sky beginning to lighten with the first hints of sunrise. "About us, I mean." Ryder considered this as he tightened the cinch on his saddle. "The truth, I suppose, that we care for each other and intend to court properly once the current situation is resolved." He glanced at her. "Unless you'd prefer discretion for now," Fiona shook her head decisively. "No more hiding, not about this. Life's too uncertain, as we discovered last night." She approached him, placing a hand on his chest. "I want everyone to know that I've chosen you, Ryder Vance, and that I'm proud to stand beside you." Her declaration warmed him through, chasing away the chill of the early morning air. He bent to kiss her once more, marveling at the fact that he could do so freely now. "Then let's go face the world together," he said when they parted. "Starting with Sheriff Donovan, who's probably got half the territory searching for us by now." They rode into Pinyon as the town was coming to life, shopkeepers opening their doors, miners heading to the early shift at the Silver Crescent. The sheriff's office was a hive of activity, with several horses hitched outside and men in conversation on the porch. Sheriff Donovan himself spotted them first, relief washing over his weathered features before quickly being replaced by concern as he noted their disheveled appearance and the absence of Ryder's rifle, which had been lost in the cabin fire. "Vance? Miss Evans." "Thank God," he exclaimed, hurrying to meet them as they dismounted. We were about to send out a search party. What happened? Quickly, Ryder recounted the events of the previous night: the Blackwell's attack, the fire, their escape and shelter at the line shack. The sheriff's expression grew increasingly grim as the tale unfolded. "Damned cowards," he muttered when Ryder finished. "Burning a man out of his own home." He shook his head disgustedly. "But I'm grateful you both made it out safely. That was quick thinking with the root cellar." "The question is, how did they find us?" Ryder asked, the thought having troubled him throughout the night. "No one knew Miss Evans would be staying at my place except you, Deputy Myers, and Mrs. Holloway." The sheriff frowned thoughtfully. "Could they have followed you from town?" "Possible, but we were careful, and you and Myers rode with us partway." Ryder shook his head. "It feels more like they knew exactly where to look." "Could be they've been watching your place for a while as a potential target," Donovan suggested. "Blackwells have been operating in this territory long enough to know most of the homesteads and who owns them." It was a plausible explanation, but something about it didn't sit right with Ryder. Still, there were more pressing concerns at the moment. "What about school today?" Fiona asked, ever mindful of her responsibilities despite everything they'd been through. "The children, already taken care of," the sheriff assured her. "When you didn't arrive at the schoolhouse this morning, Mrs. Patterson went over and told the children there'd be no school today due to an emergency. Most of them are probably enjoying an unexpected holiday as we speak." Fiona nodded, looking relieved but also conflicted. "I hate to disappoint them, but under the circumstances." "No one expects you to teach after what you've been through, Miss Evans," the sheriff said kindly. "In fact, I'd suggest you take a day or two to recover. The school board will understand." But Fiona shook her head firmly. "No, I want to continue. The children need consistency, especially in uncertain times. I'll teach tomorrow as planned." The sheriff looked as though he might argue, but something in Fiona's determined expression made him think better of it. "Very well. But we'll need to arrange secure accommodations for you both in the meantime. Clearly, staying outside town isn't an option anymore." "They can stay at my place," offered Deputy Myers, who had joined them during the conversation. "It's small, but I've got a spare room my sister uses when she visits from Santa Fe, and it's right next to the jail, so about as safe as anywhere in Pinyon." Sheriff Donovan nodded approvingly. "Good thinking, Myers." He turned to Ryder and Fiona. "Unless you have a better suggestion." Ryder glanced at Fiona, who gave a slight nod of agreement. "That sounds fine, Sheriff, and thank you, Myers. Just until we catch the Blackwells," the deputy said with a shrug. "Speaking of which, we got word this morning that the extra men from the Territorial Marshal's office should arrive by noon today. Once they're here, we can organize a proper manhunt." As the plans were being discussed, Ryder noticed that Fiona was swaying slightly on her feet, the exhaustion of their ordeal finally catching up with her. Without a word, he slipped an arm around her waist, supporting her discreetly. Sheriff Donovan noticed too and immediately cut the conversation short. "You both need rest. Myers, show them to your place and get them settled. We can talk strategy once the Territorial Marshals arrive." The deputy's home was indeed small but neat, with a spare bedroom that, while modest, was a welcome sight after their night in the line shack. Fiona sank onto the bed gratefully while Ryder conferred briefly with Myers about security arrangements. When they were finally alone, Ryder sat beside Fiona on the edge of the bed, taking her hand in his. "You should try to sleep," he suggested gently. "You're exhausted." Fiona nodded, her eyelids already heavy. "Will you stay?" she asked softly. "Just until I fall asleep." "Of course," he promised, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm not going anywhere." As she drifted off, still fully clothed atop the quilt, Ryder watched over her, his mind working through the events of the past 24 hours. Something about the Blackwell's attack still troubled him, the timing, the precision of it. It felt less like opportunistic revenge and more like a carefully planned operation. But those concerns could wait. For now, seeing Fiona safe and at rest was all that mattered. Whatever came next, they would face it together. That much, at least, was certain. The following days brought a flurry of activity to Pinyon. The territorial marshals arrived as promised, bringing with them wanted posters and detailed information about the Blackwell's recent crime spree across New Mexico. A comprehensive manhunt was organized, with teams of lawmen combing the surrounding countryside for any sign of the outlaws. Despite Sheriff Donovan's suggestion that she take time to recover, Fiona insisted on resuming her teaching duties the very next day after their ordeal. Ryder accompanied her to and from the schoolhouse, with at least one deputy always nearby during school hours. The children, sensing something significant had occurred, were unusually well behaved, and many of their parents made a point of expressing support for their new teacher. In the evenings, Ryder and Fiona stayed at Deputy Meyer's home, which had been reinforced with additional locks and shutters. Despite the circumstances, they managed to find moments of privacy to talk, to hold each other, to share soft kisses that deepened their newly acknowledged feelings. 5 days after the attack on Ryder's cabin, Sheriff Donovan called them to his office with news. His expression was both grim and satisfied as they took seats across from his desk. "We found them," he announced without preamble. "Or rather, a rancher found them about 15 miles southwest of here. Dead." Fiona gasped softly. "Both of them, the Blackwells," the sheriff nodded. "Silas and his younger brother, both shot. Looks like they had a disagreement with some other outlaws over the proceeds from the Santa Fe bank robbery. At least, that's our best guess, since the money was missing." Ryder absorbed this news with mixed emotions. Relief was foremost. The threat to Fiona was eliminated. But there was also an unsettling sense of incompletion, as though the narrative had ended too abruptly without resolution. "You're sure it's them?" he asked. "No doubt about it," Donovan confirmed. "Territorial marshals identified the bodies. Even found your rifle in their possession. Vance must have taken it from your cabin that night." Fiona reached for Ryder's hand, squeezing it gently. "It's over then," she said, her voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We're safe." "Yes, madam," the sheriff agreed. "You can go back to your normal lives now, though." He hesitated, his gaze moving between them with a knowing look. "I understand things might be a bit different than before." News of their relationship had spread quickly through Pinyon, as was inevitable in a small town. Most reactions had been supportive. Mrs. Holloway had practically beamed when Fiona explained the development. And Mrs. Patterson had started setting aside her best apple pie whenever Ryder and Fiona came into the cafe. Even the school board, initially concerned about their new teacher's romantic entanglement, had been reassured by Ryder's obvious respectability and his clear intentions toward Fiona. "Yes, things are different," Ryder acknowledged, meeting the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Miss Evans and I intend to court properly now that the danger is past." Sheriff Donovan nodded approvingly. "Glad to hear it. You two deserve some happiness after what you've been through." He rose, indicating the meeting was concluded. "You're free to return to your previous accommodations whenever you wish, though I imagine Myers won't mind if you need another day or two to make arrangements." As they left the sheriff's office, stepping out into the bright autumn sunshine, Ryder and Fiona paused on the boardwalk, the reality of their newfound safety still sinking in. "It doesn't seem real," Fiona murmured, her face turned up to the sun. "That it's actually over." Ryder understood exactly what she meant. The threat had loomed so large for the past week that its sudden removal left a strange void. "It'll take some getting used to," he agreed, "but we have time now. All the time we need." She smiled up at him, her blue eyes bright with possibilities. "What happens next? For us, I mean." It was a question Ryder had been pondering since hearing the sheriff's news. With the immediate danger gone, practical considerations came to the forefront. His cabin was destroyed, which meant he had no home to offer Fiona. His land remained, but rebuilding would take time and money. "First, I need to find a place to live in town while I rebuild the cabin," he said thoughtfully. "Then I should speak to Mr. Harrington at the mine about reducing my hours so I can work on the construction." Fiona nodded, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her expression. "And us, our courtship," Ryder's features softened as he gazed down at her. "That's the easy part," he assured her, taking her hand. "I'll call on you properly at Mrs. Holloway's. We'll take walks, have dinner at the hotel restaurant, attend church together on Sundays." He smiled. "All the things normal couples do when they're not hiding from outlaws." This drew a laugh from Fiona, the sound light and carefree in a way Ryder hadn't heard before. It struck him then that despite the danger they'd faced together, or perhaps because of it, they'd never experienced the ordinary rhythms of courtship. The realization was oddly exciting. There was still so much to learn about each other, so many simple pleasures to share. "I'd like that," Fiona said, squeezing his hand. "Very much." Later that day, Ryder escorted Fiona back to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, carrying her small valise as they walked up the path to the front porch. There was a bittersweet quality to their farewell, the first time they'd been parted since the attack on the cabin, tempered by the promise of seeing each other the following morning. "Will you be comfortable at the hotel?" Fiona asked as they lingered on the porch, reluctant to part despite the propriety demanded by their return to town living. Ryder nodded. "It's just temporary. I've already spoken to Jack Miller about helping me rebuild the cabin, bigger and better this time." He grinned. "With proper glass windows and maybe even a second bedroom." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. A home built for two, for a future together. "I should check on my land tomorrow after school," Ryder continued. "See what can be salvaged, start planning the new construction. Would you like to come with me?" Fiona's face lit up at the invitation. "I'd love to. Perhaps we could bring a picnic, make it a proper outing." "A proper outing," Ryder echoed, smiling at her enthusiasm. "It's a date." He bent to kiss her cheek, mindful of Mrs. Holloway potentially watching through the lace curtains, then stepped back. "Sleep well, Fiona. I'll see you in the morning." As he walked toward the hotel where he'd secured a room, Ryder found himself filled with an unfamiliar sense of optimism. The future stretched before him, full of possibilities that had seemed remote just weeks ago: a home, a horse ranch, and most importantly, a life shared with Fiona. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Ryder Vance was looking forward to tomorrow. The next afternoon, as promised, Ryder took Fiona to see his land. The October day was perfect, crisp and clear, with just enough warmth from the sun to make riding pleasant. They carried a picnic basket prepared by Mrs. Holloway, who had embraced their courtship with enthusiasm, constantly finding excuses to sing Ryder's praises to anyone who would listen. As they approached the property, Ryder felt a pang at the sight of his ruined cabin. The fire had consumed most of the structure, leaving only blackened timbers and the stone chimney standing amid the ashes. But the rest of the land was untouched, the corral still sturdy, the creek flowing clear and bright in the autumn sunlight, the grass beginning to turn golden with the changing season. "It's still beautiful," Fiona said softly as they dismounted. "The land itself, I mean." Ryder nodded, surveying the damage with a practical eye. "The cabin can be rebuilt, better than before." He pointed to an area slightly uphill from the burned structure. "I'm thinking of building there this time. Better view and less chance of the creek flooding in spring." Fiona walked beside him as he toured the property, pointing out his plans where the new stable would stand, the paddocks for breeding stock, the garden he envisioned. She listened intently, offering suggestions occasionally, her enthusiasm matching his own. They spread their picnic on a flat rock overlooking the creek, the same spot where they'd sat on their first outing together. As they ate, Ryder found himself watching Fiona more than the view, struck once again by how naturally she fit into this setting, into his dreams for the future. "What?" she asked, catching his gaze. "Just thinking how right you look here," he admitted, "like you belong." A soft blush colored her cheeks. "I was thinking the same thing about belonging." She hesitated, then continued, "Ryder, there's something I need to ask you, and I hope it's not too forward of me." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Ask away. That is, do you intend?" She took a breath, visibly gathering her courage. "Is marriage something you're considering?" "For us, I mean. Eventually." The directness of the question caught him by surprise, though in retrospect it shouldn't have. Fiona had proven herself to be forthright in all things, one of the many qualities he admired about her. "Yes," he replied simply. "Very much so." "I thought I'd made that clear, but if not, yes, Fiona, I want to marry you. When you're ready." The smile that lit her face was dazzling. "I needed to be sure," she explained, "because I've been thinking about the future too, about building something here together." She gestured at the surrounding land. "I can see it so clearly, teaching at the school in town, coming home to this place to you. Children eventually, running across these fields." The vision she painted matched so perfectly with his own dreams that Ryder felt his throat tighten with emotion. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object he'd been carrying for the past 2 days, waiting for the right moment. "I bought this in town yesterday," he said, opening his palm to reveal a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "It was my mother's originally. I had it sent from Texas after." He cleared his throat. "After I realized how I felt about you, I was waiting for the right time to ask, but since you've brought it up." Fiona's eyes widened as she stared at the ring, then lifted to meet his gaze. "Ryder." He took her hand gently in his. "Fiona Evans, will you marry me? Not immediately, we can wait until the cabin's rebuilt, or longer if you prefer. But I know with absolute certainty that you're the woman I want to spend my life with." "Yes," she whispered, tears shimmering in her blue eyes. "Yes, Ryder Vance, I will marry you." A small laugh escaped her. "And I don't mind waiting until the cabin's rebuilt, but not a day longer than necessary." With hands that weren't entirely steady, Ryder slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "I promise to make you happy," he said softly, "to build a good life for us here." "You already make me happy," Fiona replied, leaning forward to seal their engagement with a kiss that spoke of promises kept and a future shared. The following months passed in a blur of activity. Ryder divided his time between his work at the mine and the construction of the new cabin, which quickly evolved into plans for a proper house, as Fiona's input was incorporated. She continued teaching at the school, winning the hearts of her students and their parents with her dedication and innovative teaching methods. Their engagement became official with an announcement in the local newspaper, followed by a small celebration at Mrs. Patterson's cafe, where the entire town seemed to turn out to wish them well. Mrs. Holloway appointed herself unofficial wedding planner, consulting frequently with Fiona about every detail from the bride's dress to the cake flavors. By the time spring arrived in 1879, the new house was taking shape on Ryder's land, a sturdy 2-bedroom structure with a wide porch facing the creek, large windows to let in light, and a spacious kitchen that Fiona had specifically requested. The stable was nearly complete as well, ready for the breeding stock Ryder had begun to acquire with the proceeds from selling his share in a small silver claim. Their wedding was set for June, after the school term ended, allowing Fiona to fulfill her teaching obligations before beginning her new life as Mrs. Vance. As the day approached, preparations intensified, with seemingly the entire town involved in ensuring the event would be memorable. On a warm evening in late May, Ryder and Fiona sat on the porch of the nearly completed house, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. In just 2 weeks, this would be their home, their life together officially begun. "Can you believe how far we've come in less than a year?" Fiona mused, her head resting on Ryder's shoulder. "From a chance encounter on a dusty street to this." Ryder's arm tightened around her. "Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I hadn't been at the livery stable that day, if I hadn't seen the Blackwells dragging you to that horse." "But you were there," Fiona said softly. "You saw, and you acted, and everything good in our lives now grew from that moment." It was true, Ryder reflected. That split-second decision to intervene had changed the course of both their lives irrevocably. What had begun as a simple act of decency had led to the greatest happiness he'd ever known. "No regrets, then?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Fiona turned to face him, her blue eyes serious in the fading light. "None whatsoever. Every step of our journey, even the dangerous parts, led us here." "How could I regret that?" Ryder leaned down to kiss her, marveling as always at the depth of feeling this woman stirred in him. 2 weeks, he murmured against her lips. 2 weeks until you're officially Mrs. Vance." "I can hardly wait," Fiona replied with a smile that promised a lifetime of happiness to come. Their wedding day dawned bright and clear, the June sky a flawless blue above Pinyon as the town turned out for the celebration. The ceremony took place in the small church, with Sheriff Donovan giving the bride away and Deputy Myers serving as best man. Fiona was radiant in a gown of ivory satin that Mrs. Holloway had helped her select from a catalog, a crown of wildflowers in her honey blonde hair. As they exchanged vows, Ryder was struck by the journey that had brought them to this moment, the danger they'd faced together, the bond that had formed in the crucible of those experiences, the love that had blossomed despite, or perhaps because of, the adversity they'd overcome. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared to the packed church. "You may kiss the bride." Ryder didn't hesitate, drawing Fiona into his arms and sealing their union with a kiss that drew cheers and a few good-natured whistles from the assembled guests. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Vance, the applause was deafening. The reception that followed lasted well into the evening, with the entire town joining in the celebration at the newly completed Vance homestead. There was music and dancing, generous amounts of food and drink, and an atmosphere of genuine joy that reflected the community's affection for the couple. As the festivities wound down and the guests gradually departed, Ryder and Fiona stood on the porch of their new home, waving goodbye to the last wagons heading back to town. The house behind them was quiet now, filled with wedding gifts and ready to begin its role as the heart of their shared life. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance," Ryder said softly, drawing Fiona into his arms as the last wagon disappeared from view. She looked up at him, her face glowing with happiness in the light of the rising moon. "Home," she repeated, savoring the word. "Our home. I love the sound of that." "As do I," Ryder agreed, lifting her effortlessly into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Inside, the house was simple but comfortable, with furniture they'd selected together and touches that reflected both their tastes. Books from Fiona's collection sharing shelf space with Ryder's few treasured possessions. A quilt made by her mother spread across their bed, photographs of both their families displayed on the mantel. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their first night as husband and wife, Fiona traced lazy patterns on Ryder's chest, her voice drowsy with contentment. You ever think about how different our lives might have been if you hadn't been there that day? If you hadn't cut me free from those ropes, Ryder's arms tightened around her. I try not to think about it, the idea of you in the Blackwell's hands. He shook his head, banishing the thought. Besides, I believe we would have found each other somehow, even if it hadn't happened that way. Some things are just meant to be. Fiona smiled against his skin. That's remarkably romantic thinking for a former Texas Ranger. You've changed me, he admitted, stroking her hair, in all the best ways. We've changed each other, she corrected gently. And we'll keep changing, growing together. That's what marriage is, isn't it? So I'm told, Ryder replied with a soft chuckle. We'll figure it out as we go. As Fiona drifted off to sleep in his arms, Ryder remained awake a while longer, reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had led them to this moment. From a chance encounter on a dusty street to a love that promised to last a lifetime, their story had been one of danger overcome and happiness hard won. Whatever the future held, the horse ranch they were building, the family they hoped to create, the life they would share, Ryder knew with absolute certainty that he would face it with Fiona by his side. And that knowledge, more than anything else, gave him a sense of peace and purpose he'd never known before. 5 years later, the Vance homestead had blossomed into one of the most successful horse breeding operations in the New Mexico territory. Ryder's careful selection of stock and Fiona's meticulous record-keeping had built them a reputation that brought buyers from as far away as Colorado and Texas. The house had expanded as well, with a new wing added to accommodate their growing family. 3-year-old James, named for Ryder's father, was the spitting image of his father, with the same serious brown eyes and quiet demeanor. 1-year-old Elizabeth, or Ellie as they called her, had her mother's honey blonde hair and curious nature, already toddling determinedly after her brother across the yard. Fiona had continued teaching for 2 years after their marriage, before resigning to focus on their first child and the growing ranch business. She still substituted occasionally at the Pinyon School, unable to entirely give up her love of education, and had started a small lending library on their property that drew neighboring families every Sunday after church. On a warm September afternoon, Ryder stood on the porch watching Fiona in the garden. Ellie perched on her hip as she pointed out different flowers and vegetables to the fascinated toddler. James was helping Ryder's ranch hand, Miguel, feed the horses in the nearby corral, his small face serious as he carefully counted out scoops of grain. The scene filled Ryder with a contentment so profound, it was almost overwhelming. This was the life he'd dreamed of but never truly believed he'd have: a loving wife, healthy children, work that fulfilled him, a home that was truly his own. "Papa," James called, spotting him on the porch. "Come see, Rusty did a trick." Ryder smiled and stepped down to join his son. The old gelding, now in comfortable retirement, still had a few surprises left apparently. As James demonstrated how he'd taught the elderly horse to bow its head for a carrot, Ryder felt Fiona's presence beside him, her arm slipping around his waist. "He's got your way with horses," she observed, leaning against him as Ellie reached out to be transferred to her father's arms. "And your patience. God help us if he inherits my stubbornness too," Ryder replied with a grin, settling their daughter comfortably against his chest. Fiona laughed. "Too late. Have you tried getting him to bed lately? Stubborn as a mule, just like his father." Their easy banter was interrupted by the sound of an approaching wagon. Visitors were common enough these days, with the ranch's growing reputation, but unannounced arrivals were still unusual. "Are you expecting anyone?" Ryder asked, handing Ellie back to Fiona as he recognized the elderly couple in the approaching buggy. "Sheriff and Mrs. Donovan," Fiona identified them with some surprise. "No, they weren't expected. I hope nothing's wrong in town." Donovan had retired from his position 2 years earlier, handing over the badge to Deputy Myers after a distinguished career keeping order in Pinyon. He and his wife lived quietly on the edge of town now, occasionally visiting the Vances but rarely without advance notice. "Robert, Margaret," Ryder greeted them as they pulled up in front of the house. "This is an unexpected pleasure." The former sheriff, his hair now completely white but his posture still straight as a ramrod, helped his wife down from the buggy before approaching with an envelope in his hand. "Sorry to drop in unannounced, Vance, Fiona. But this came by special courier to the jail, addressed to you both, and Myers thought it might be important." Ryder took the envelope curiously. It bore an official-looking seal and was indeed addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Ryder Vance with the notation "Urgent Personal" in the corner. "Come inside," Fiona invited, her curiosity evident. "We were just about to have lemonade." As the Donovans made themselves comfortable in the parlor, exclaiming over how much the children had grown since their last visit, Ryder opened the envelope. Inside was a letter on official stationery from the New Mexico Territorial Governor's office. He scanned it quickly, his expression changing from curiosity to shock. "What is it?" Fiona asked, noticing his reaction as she returned from the kitchen with a tray of lemonade. Wordlessly, Ryder handed her the letter. She read it, her blue eyes widening with each line. "I don't understand," she finally said, looking up at Donovan. "Why now, after all this time?" The former sheriff sighed heavily. "That's why I brought it personally. I thought you might have questions." He accepted a glass of lemonade from Fiona with a nod of thanks. "The truth is, we've known parts of this story for years, but the final pieces only came together recently when one of the men confessed on his deathbed." Ryder reread the letter, still struggling to process its contents. It was a formal notification that the true circumstances surrounding the Blackwell brothers' deaths 5 years earlier had finally been discovered. They had not, as originally believed, died at the hands of rival outlaws in a dispute over stolen money. Rather, they had been executed by members of a vigilante committee formed by several prominent citizens of Pinyon, specifically to eliminate the threat the Blackwells posed to the town and, in particular, to Ryder and Fiona. "You knew about this?" Ryder asked Donovan, his voice carefully neutral. The older man shifted uncomfortably. "Not at first. By the time I began to suspect, it was already done. And to be honest, Vance, I wasn't inclined to look too closely at how a couple of murderers and kidnappers met their end. Who was involved?" Fiona asked quietly, glancing toward the children who were now playing contentedly under Margaret Donovan's watchful eye. "The letter names them," Donovan replied. "Harrison Miller, the banker, Doc Peterson, Jacob Turner from the general store, a few others." He hesitated, then added reluctantly, "and Myers. That's why he sent me with the letter instead of coming himself. He wasn't sure how you'd react." Ryder sat back, absorbing this information. These were men he knew, men he'd done business with for years, men whose children had been taught by Fiona. The idea that they had formed a secret committee to eliminate the Blackwells on his and Fiona's behalf was difficult to comprehend. "Why tell us now?" Fiona asked, voicing the question that was foremost in Ryder's mind as well. "Harrison Miller died last month," Donovan explained. "Consumption." On his deathbed, he made a full confession to Reverend Simmons, who felt obligated to report it to the authorities. The territorial governor has decided not to pursue charges against the surviving members of the committee, given the circumstances and the time that's passed, but he felt you deserved to know the truth. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the children's laughter from the corner where they played. Finally, Ryder spoke, his voice thoughtful. "All these years, I've wondered about certain things that didn't quite add up. How the Blackwells found my homestead so quickly. how they were supposedly killed by rivals who were never identified. He looked at Donovan directly. It was a setup, wasn't it? The committee leaked information about Fiona staying at my cabin to draw the Blackwells out. The former sheriff nodded slowly. That's my understanding. They knew the Blackwells would come after you both, so they created an opportunity. Then followed and took care of the problem. They put us in danger deliberately, Fiona asked, a hint of anger in her voice. We could have died in that fire. I don't think they anticipated the fire, Donovan replied. From what Myers told me later, they expected to catch the Blackwells before they reached your cabin. But Silas and his brother moved faster than expected. Ryder placed a calming hand on Fiona's arm, understanding her anger but also seeing the bigger picture. They were trying to protect us in their own way. And the town. The Blackwells had killed before and would have killed again. That doesn't make it right, Fiona insisted, though some of the heat had gone out of her voice. No, Ryder agreed, but it explains a lot. He turned back to Donovan. What does the governor expect us to do with this information? The older man shrugged. Nothing officially. The letter is simply a courtesy, an acknowledgement that you deserve to know the truth. Unofficially. He hesitated. Myers asked me to convey his deepest apologies. He was a young deputy then, caught up in something bigger than himself, but he's carried the guilt of it all these years. Ryder nodded slowly, processing this. Tell him I understand, and while I can't say I approve of the methods, I appreciate the intention behind them. Fiona was quieter, her gaze moving to their children playing innocently across the room. I need time to think about this, she said finally. 5 years ago, those men made decisions that put our lives at risk without our knowledge or consent, but they also removed a threat that might have followed us forever. She sighed deeply. It's a lot to take in. Margaret Donovan, who had been silent during the entire exchange, finally spoke up. Perhaps what matters most isn't how the danger ended, but what you've built since then. She gestured to the comfortable home around them, to the children, to the visible signs of prosperity and happiness. Look at what you've created together. That's the real legacy of those events, isn't it? Her simple wisdom resonated with both Ryder and Fiona. Whatever the complicated truth behind the Blackwells' deaths, the life they'd built together in the years since was real and precious. Thank you for bringing this to us personally, Ryder said to the Donovans, rising to indicate the difficult conversation was concluded. We appreciate your friendship, today and 5 years ago. After the Donovans departed, Ryder and Fiona sat together on the porch swing, watching their children play in the yard as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains. For a long time, neither spoke, each lost in their own thoughts about the revelations of the day. Does it change anything for you? Fiona finally asked, her head resting on Ryder's shoulder. Knowing that it wasn't fate or justice that removed the Blackwells from our lives, but deliberate action by men we know. Ryder considered this carefully. It changes how I understand what happened, he admitted, but not how I feel about what we've built since then. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the wedding band that had not left her finger in 5 years. Everything good in our lives, our marriage, our children, this ranch, it all began the moment I saw you being dragged across that street and decided to act. And I decided to trust the stranger with the knife who cut me free, Fiona added with a small smile. Despite my mother's warnings about dangerous Western men, Ryder laughed softly. We've come a long way from that day, and we have a long way still to go together, Fiona replied, her voice warm with promise. As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of orange and purple, Ryder Vance reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance encounter born of danger to a love that had only deepened with time, their story was one of courage, commitment, and the kind of happiness that comes from building something meaningful together. Whatever complications the past might hold, the future stretched before them bright with possibility, their children growing, their ranch thriving, their love enduring. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered.